Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte halts patrols in the South China Sea and says this month's war games between the Philippines and the United States will be the last. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's a remarkable move by the new Philippine president. President Rodrigo Duterte says he's ordered the end of joint patrols and naval exercises with the United States in the South China Sea. Duterte says this month's joint military exercises will be the last, and he's calling on all U.S. forces who were involved in surveillance of Islamic militants to leave the country. The move could signal the end of a 65-year-old military alliance. The Filipino president has been outspoken against the United States after U.S. President Barack Obama criticized his crackdown on drug crime. Duterte says he no longer needs U.S. military aid and will strengthen diplomatic ties with China and Russia. We begin with this report from CCTV's Barnaby Lowe in Zambales.
America has failed the Philippines. Words coming from the country's Foreign Affairs Secretary, Perfecto Yasay, essentially echoing President Rodrigo Duterte's sentiment. Duterte has had outbursts against the United States almost on a daily basis starting last month, when a reporter asked him about the possibility of U.S. President Barack Obama bringing up the issue of extrajudicial killings in a meeting at the ASEAN summit. That meeting, of course, did not happen. Since then, he's demanded U.S. troops leave the southern Philippines, joint Philippines and U.S. patrols in the South China Sea stop, that the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014 by the Philippines and the United States be reviewed, and that these war games happening behind me be the last, at least under his term. Now, while these pronouncements have not necessarily translated to policy, the message seems clearer now than ever before. Secretary Yasay says decades of military alliance between the U.S. and the Philippines have not enhanced the Philippines' defense capabilities to a point where it can sufficiently defend the country from external threats. He added that the carrot and stick policy of the U.S. towards the Philippines has been effectively used to force Filipinos into submission to American demands and interests. Now, the Philippines defense chief also saying all the Philippine military has gotten from America are hand-me-downs. The armed forces, he says, can survive without foreign aid. This is exactly what Duterte has told the U.S., the European Union, and the United States. Go ahead, he says, withdraw your aid. So, will these war games be the last? At this point, it's unclear. There are discussions, but for now, the U.S. says they continue to focus on their commitment to assist the Philippines. Barnaby Lowe, CCTV, Zambales, the Philippines.
Joining us now from Beijing is Victor Ga. He's a Chinese international relations expert and translator. From Brussels, we're joined by Richard Jawed Haidarian. He's a foreign affairs and economic analyst focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Saurabh Gupta. He's a resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. And from Perth, Australia, via Skype, we're joined by Isan Oh. He's an adjunct senior fellow with the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Victor, let's look at this relationship between the United States and the Philippines. They've been close allies. Why has this relationship deteriorated so quickly shortly after the election of President Duterte?
Well, I would say the recent transformation of the relations between the Philippines and the United States is one of those rare international developments that the whole world is watching with great interest and curiosity. I would say, in essence, the new Filipino president has realized that the Philippines should not be used as an instrument to serve the interest of the United States foreign policy. After all, even though the Philippines is an ally of the United States, Philippines is an independent country with full sovereignty, and the Philippines should not get involved in a situation in which it will become a victim if, for example, the Philippines is signed up to the bandwagon of the United States to serve the interest of the United States in the Southeast Asian region. Therefore, I think by the end of the day, the Filipino people and the government need to realize what is its own national interest and what's the best way to serve its own national interest. I think President Duterte is leading the country in that direction, rather than letting the Philippines becoming a surrogate of the United States or the 51st state of the United States.
Richard, here we have two countries that go back a long way. The United States was once the colonial power in the Philippines. How important is this relationship between the two countries? Just, you know, the diplomatic relationship, economic and strategic, of course.
Well, first of all, there's not much surprise with the rhetoric of President Duterte, because even shortly after his election victory in May, he said that he wants a much more independent foreign policy for the Philippines, and he specified that means less dependence on the United States. He's a self-described socialist and has always been critical of the United States' role in Asia and in the Philippines in particular. At the same time, I think he's also very much irritated by the United States and President Obama's criticism of his war on drugs on human rights grounds. So this is his way of retaliating against the criticism that is coming out of the West. And lastly, he's visiting China in the coming weeks, and of course he's trying to signal to China that he's a different Filipino leader. He's an independent sovereign leader that is willing to in fact negotiate the parameters of Philippine-US relations in order to have better relationship with China and therefore be able to get concessions in the South China Sea. Nonetheless, without a question, the United States is extremely influential in the Philippines. Last year in a Pew Research survey, 92% of Filipinos had a positive view of the United States. The Philippine military has been trained, has been financed, and has been logistically equipped by the United States for decades after decades. 75% of the entire armaments of the Philippines come from the United States. And I think it will be very difficult for President Duterte to completely sever existing ties with the U.S., but perhaps he's willing to recalibrate relations with U.S. in order to reach out to China and find a modus vivendi in the South China Sea.
Ihsan, the Philippines leader has, as Richard has pointed out, said that he wants to pursue a new independent foreign policy, but it doesn't seem to be just an independent foreign policy. He seems to be making very hostile statements against the United States, making it clear that the Philippines in the future will not fashion its foreign policy after or according to the dictates of the United States. What do you make of that?
Well, it would certainly appear as such, judging from his various very fiery statements over the past few months. I think, however, this sort of vacillating between the United States and China, I think there's an international dimension to it. That is, for example, Mr. Duterte's calculation to derive perhaps the best benefit out of either the United States or China by means of nowadays, for example, he knows that in the United States, the politicians, including President Obama, could take a much higher level of tolerance in terms of his very fiery statements, and therefore he makes full use of that. On the other hand, he knows that China do not usually take those statements too kindly, and therefore he is more subdued to it. But I think at the end of the day, he's trying to squeeze out the best deals, for example, in weapons purchase between the two countries. I mean, between the United States and China in terms of cheaper but perhaps better weapons, to see who can provide him with that.
So, Rob, only 6 months ago, the United States Defense Secretary Ashton Carter told us that U.S. troops and military equipment would be sent on regular rotations into the Philippines. The interests of the two countries' security was firmly entwined. They even were on joint patrols in the South China Sea. What happened?
It's interesting to figure out exactly what happened, and it's still difficult to say exactly where the situation is going. The way I look at it is that the broader US-Philippines alliance will remain intact, but to the extent that it was extended out in the direction of the South China Sea, in that respect, the Philippines wants to hold back because it feels that the US and Philippines ganging up together in the South China Sea just complicates the situation and compounds the tensions further. So we need to see where this is going. My sense is things like joint patrols and joint activities which are directly related to defense of South China Sea assets or islands are the ones which will perhaps deteriorate. But I do not think that the overall alliance between the US and Philippines, which has stood for so long since the 1950s, would be damaged gravely. I think President Duterte is trying to create a little bit of that space, that alliance which is there, intended for the defense of the Philippines, does not get extended too far out, where it compounds and complicates the situation in the South China Sea, which has multiple parties and multiple complications to it.
Victor, how big and how permanent is this break in the relationship? President Duterte said that joint military exercise with the United States, which is taking place right now, will be the last. There will be no more while he is president. How much of a blow is that to U.S. strategic interests?
No, I think even though the Philippines and the United States have this decades-old alliance with each other, the Philippines, after all, is an independent country with full sovereign rights, and the Philippines does not need to become a surrogate of the United States as far as its foreign policy is concerned. The Philippines also need to put a premium on peace and stability and the ability to achieve higher growth rate, for example, for its own people. And therefore, I think as far as the Philippines is concerned, to be friends with as many countries as possible, especially its immediate neighbor, China, is probably very, very important. And that means the Philippines can remain a good ally of the United States while becoming a better and closer friends of major trading partners like China. If you look at the ASEAN 10 member states, all the other countries are having very robust and brisk business relations with China. Why should the Philippines be the only exception with very low level of trade with China? And if China can provide financial support, for example, infrastructure capability, if China can really help the Philippines to build up its infrastructure, railways, highways, connections between bridges, etc., financial support, why not? I think President Duterte is really looking at the fundamental interest of the Filipino people. Of course, it wants to keep its alliance with, for example, the United States, but that should not become an obstacle to developing closer trading relations with the largest trading partner in this part of the world, which is China.
Richard, the United States says it has a, quote, ironclad relationship with the Philippines, but I'm wondering to what extent, as Isan Oh pointed out a moment ago, is the Philippines playing one country against the other to get the best deal, not just in military sales, but also in trade, also in aid?
Yeah. Well, that's definitely one hypothesis that has been going around, and a lot of supporters of Duterte are trying to say he's such a smart guy trying to play the superpowers against each other. But I don't think he needs to be doing that with such an offensive remarks and language. I'm now in the European Union, and I've also been in the U.S., and the impression I get is that many people are losing patience with Mr. Duterte. I mean, this is not the Cold War era where, you know, a small third world country can play Soviet Union, U.S. against each other. At some point, they're going to lose patience. Nonetheless, when it comes to Duterte, the number one problem with him is that it's never clear whether it's braggadocio and bravado or whether it's a clear policy statement. Over the past few weeks, he has said that he's going to expel American special forces from Mindanao. He's going to cancel joint patrols with U.S. in the South China Sea. He's not going to have any more joint exercises. And yet, if you look at the statements of his defense minister, statements from other officials in the government, they either try to downplay it or try to contradict it. And so far, we have not seen a single formal request from the Philippines to really downgrade bilateral ties. So far, it seems this is more of braggadocio and bravado, but I won't be surprised if, as part of a deal with China, to get concessions from China in the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, he may be willing to actually suspend joint patrols with the U.S. in the South China Sea and at least relocate the joint exercises, Balikatan exercises, from the South China Sea to a less controversial area, because China is clearly very irritated with those Philippine-U.S. security activities in the South China Sea. Nonetheless, just to put it very quickly, but there's a limit to how far Duterte can go. Actually, I disagree with the idea that this is going to make him look better with Filipinos. A lot of Filipinos are very pro-American. In fact, a lot of staunch Duterte supporters feel conflicted about his pats and dust-ups with President Obama and his diplomatic flirtation with China. Let's not forget, China had a negative 45 approval rating or favorability rating last year in the Philippines, and it's still very much seen negatively by a lot of Filipinos because of the disputes in the South China Sea. So there's just so far that Duterte can go, and he has to be careful not to overplay his card by being too insulting.
Yeah, Richard, there has been an indication that there is support for his policies in the Philippines. There was a survey published just a few days ago which showed that 76% of respondents was satisfied with his performance.
That's an assessment of his overall performance, and if you look at his domestic policy agenda, it's mostly on the war on drugs.
Okay.
And lastly, let's remember this is the honeymoon period. All Filipino presidents at this stage in their presidency had around 60 to 70% net satisfaction rating.